Few places on this earth have stood at the crossroads of civilization, war, religion, and rebirth as consistently and as brutally as the land we now call Turkey. This is not just a country. This is not just a nation-state carved on a map by politicians and treaties. This is a civilization, a living, breathing, bleeding civilization that has survived everything the world has thrown at it. Conquerors, plagues, betrayals, revolutions, and the collapse of empires that once made the world tremble. In the next few minutes, we are going to compress 700 years of strategy, survival, and transformation into one single story. From the towering minarets of the Ottoman Caliphate to the secular corridors of Ankara, from the sword of Suleiman the Magnificent to the ballot box of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. But here is the most important thing you need to understand before we begin. Turkey has never simply reacted to history. Turkey has always shaped it. And that strategy, that deep, ancient, calculating strategy, is what this video is truly about. One word defines this entire story: survival. Not survival in the passive sense, not the survival of a people hiding in caves or mountains, but the survival of an idea, the survival of identity, the survival of power through transformation. Every empire that has ever controlled this land, whether it was the Byzantines, the Mongols, the Western colonial powers, or the secular revolutionaries of the 20th century, every single one of them believed they had finally broken Turkey, finally changed it, finally ended it. They were all wrong. Because Turkey does not break. It bends, it transforms, it absorbs, and then it comes back stronger, with a new identity built upon the bones of the old one. This is the pattern we will see again and again throughout this story. Remember this pattern. It is the key to understanding everything. To understand Turkey, we must first understand the land itself, Anatolia, because the Turks did not arrive to an empty wilderness. They arrived to one of the most ancient, most fought-over pieces of real estate in all of human history. The Hittites built a great empire here over 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. They created one of the first known peace treaties in history with the Egyptians around 1259 BCE. Think about that. While much of the world was still in primitive tribal societies, the people of this land were already writing international diplomacy. Then came the Greeks, colonizing the Aegean coasts, building great cities like Ephesus and Troy, whose very name echoes across 3,000 years of myth and legend. The Persian Empire swept through. Alexander the Great conquered it and called it the gateway to Asia. Rome absorbed it, made it a province, and built roads, aqueducts, and amphitheaters that still stand today. Then came Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, built by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. It became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the most sophisticated, most cultured, most powerful civilization of the medieval world. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as the center of the Christian world. Its Hagia Sophia was the largest cathedral on earth. Its walls were considered impenetrable. Its emperors called themselves the heirs of Rome and the chosen of God. But somewhere to the east, in the vast steppes of Central Asia, a storm was gathering. The Turkic peoples did not appear suddenly. Their migration into Anatolia was a slow generational movement, tribes moving west across Central Asia over centuries, pressing into Persia, into the Arab Caliphate's territories, and finally into the edges of the Byzantine world. By the 11th century, a particular branch of these Turkic peoples, the Seljuks, had converted to Islam, absorbed Persian and Arab culture, and built a powerful empire stretching from Central Asia to the edges of Anatolia. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan did something that stunned the entire medieval world. He defeated the Byzantine emperor in battle and captured him alive. This was the moment the door opened. Byzantine control over Anatolia began to crumble. Turkic tribes poured into the region, not as a single organized army, but as wave after wave of semi-nomadic warriors, settling, raiding, building. The Byzantines pushed back. The Crusaders from Europe tried to reclaim the land. But the demographic tide had turned. Over the next 2 centuries, Anatolia transformed. Greek and Armenian Christian populations found themselves living under Turkic and Islamic rule in much of the interior. The old Byzantine world was fracturing, and from the chaos of this fracture, a new power was being born, small, overlooked, on the very edge of the Byzantine frontier, a tiny principality, a tribal state, led by a man named Osman. In the late 13th century, Osman Thumremers was the leader of a small Turkic tribal state in northwestern Anatolia. So small, so insignificant, that the great powers of his age barely noticed him. The Byzantines saw him as a minor nuisance. The Mongols, who had just devastated the Islamic world, saw him as a frontier chieftain, not even worth conquering. They were making the greatest miscalculation in medieval history. Osman was not just a warrior. He was a political genius. He built alliances through marriage and diplomacy. He welcomed refugees from Mongol-destroyed lands, scholars, merchants, soldiers, integrating them into his growing state. He positioned his principality as a holy frontier state, a Ghazi kingdom dedicated to expanding the borders of Islam against the Byzantines. This gave him both religious legitimacy and a constant supply of motivated warriors. His son Orhan, and then his grandson Murad I, expanded the empire with stunning speed. They crossed into Europe, into the Balkans, a move that permanently changed the political geography of the continent. The Ottoman Empire was now not just an Anatolian power, it was a European power, a world power. But the true moment of destiny came in 1453. Under Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, the Ottomans finally accomplished what no army had managed in 1,000 years. They breached the walls of Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the died fighting on the walls. The city fell. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the Christian world, was converted into a mosque. The world was never the same again. What made the Ottomans different from ordinary empires was their system of governance. The millet system allowed Christians, Jews, and other minorities to maintain their own laws, courts, and religious practices under Ottoman protection. This was not liberal democracy, but for its era, it was remarkably sophisticated tolerance. Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire reached its absolute peak under Sultan Süleyman I, known in Europe as the Magnificent, and among his own people as the Lawgiver. Ruling from 1520 to 1566, Suleiman commanded an empire that stretched from Hungary in the north to Yemen in the south, from Algeria in the west to the borders of Persia in the east. His navy, commanded by the legendary Hayreddin Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean Sea so completely that European sailors called it the Ottoman Lake. His armies twice laid siege to Vienna, the gateway to the heart of Europe. European kings wrote letters to him as if writing to God's representative on earth, because in many ways, as the Caliph of Islam, that is exactly what he claimed to be. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire was not merely a military machine. It was a cultural powerhouse. The architect Mimar Sinan built the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, an architectural masterpiece that rivaled anything in Europe or the Islamic world. Ottoman poetry, calligraphy, miniature painting, and philosophy flourished. The legal codes Suleiman created, the Kanuname, organized Ottoman society with a sophistication that European legal systems would not match for another century. This was the high point. But as every student of history knows, what goes up must eventually find its way back down. And for the Ottomans, the descent would be long, painful, and ultimately catastrophic. The decline of the Ottoman Empire did not happen overnight. It happened over centuries, a slow, grinding erosion that the Ottomans fought against with every tool at their disposal, but could never quite reverse. The causes were many and intertwined. European powers were rapidly industrializing, building new technologies of war and commerce that the Ottomans struggled to match. The empire was simply too large to govern efficiently. Communications across thousands of miles in an era before railways and telegraphs were nearly impossible. Local governors became increasingly autonomous, often acting as independent rulers. The sultans in Istanbul became increasingly dependent on palace politics. Nationalism, that new and explosive ideology born in Europe, began to tear the empire apart from the inside. The Greeks won independence in the 1820s. The Serbs, by the 19th century, European diplomats were openly calling the Ottoman state the sick man of Europe, an empire dying on its feet, kept alive only because the European powers feared what would happen if it collapsed too quickly, and they had to fight each other over the remains. The Ottomans tried to modernize desperately. The Tanzimat reforms of the 1840s attempted to create a constitutional monarchy, equal rights for all subjects regardless of religion, and a modern military. But every reform was too little, too late, and was resisted by powerful conservative forces within the empire itself. Then came the decision that would seal the empire's fate. In 1914, the Ottoman leadership, dominated by a triumvirate of nationalist military officers known as the Three Pashas, made the catastrophic decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It seemed logical at the time. Germany was strong, modern, and offering military assistance. The Ottomans hoped a German victory would drive back the Russians in the east and perhaps reverse some of their territorial losses. Instead, it destroyed them. The war was a humanitarian disaster on a scale the Ottomans had never seen. On the Eastern Front, a brutal war against Russia, combined with the Ottoman government's violent deportation of Armenian populations, an event the Armenians called genocide, and which remains one of history's most contested and painful chapters. At Gallipoli, the Ottomans won their only major defensive victory, repelling a massive Allied invasion, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. By 1918, it was over. The Ottomans had lost. The victorious Allied powers, Britain, France, and their partners, carved up the remaining Ottoman territories like a colonial feast. The Armenians were promised a state in the east. The Arabs were divided into British and French mandates. The Straits of Istanbul were internationalized. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been one of the most powerful forces on earth. Now it was being dismembered by European diplomats in Paris, as if it were a piece of furniture to be divided among heirs. It seemed like the end, the complete and final end. But Turkey had survived everything before, and it was about to survive this too. From the wreckage of the Ottoman defeat, a soldier emerged, a general who had won glory at Gallipoli, a man who had watched the old empire collapse and made a radical decision. The empire was dead, and trying to resurrect it was futile. What was needed was something completely new. Mustafa Kemal, later given the surname Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks, launched the Turkish War of Independence in 1919. Operating from Ankara in the Anatolian interior, far from the Allied-occupied Istanbul, he organized resistance forces from the remnants of the Ottoman army and the Anatolian peasantry. He fought the Greeks, who had landed in Smyrna, modern Izmir, and were pushing deep into Anatolia. He pushed back. Against every expectation, he succeeded. By 1922, the Greek army had been expelled from Anatolia in a brutal campaign that included one of history's largest population exchanges. Over 1 million Greeks left Turkey, and hundreds of thousands of Muslims left Greece, in a forced demographic reorganization that permanently defined the modern borders of both nations. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres. The Turkish Republic was born, but Ataturk was not finished. He did not just want to create a new state. He wanted to create a completely new civilization. With breathtaking speed and iron will, he dismantled the Ottoman system root and branch. The Sultanate was abolished. The Caliphate, the religious leadership of the entire Sunni Islamic world that the Ottomans had held for centuries, was abolished. Islamic law was replaced with European civil codes. The Arabic script was replaced with the Latin alphabet. Women were given the right to vote before most European nations gave it to them. Religious education was moved out of state schools. The fez, the traditional Ottoman hat, was banned, replaced with European-style hats. Ataturk's message was radical and unambiguous. Turkey would survive by becoming something entirely new. The future was secular, modern, Western, and scientific. The Ottoman and Islamic past was to be left behind. This transformation was not painless. Conservatives resisted. Religious scholars protested. There were rebellions. Ataturk suppressed them all with the same iron will that had won the war. By his death in 1938, he had fundamentally changed what it meant to be Turkish. After Ataturk, Turkey navigated one of the most dangerous geopolitical periods in history with remarkable strategic skill. During World War II, Turkey officially remained neutral, a masterpiece of diplomatic balancing. It maintained trade relationships with both the Allies and the Axis powers, supplied both sides with vital minerals, and avoided being drawn into a war that devastated every neighboring country. When the Cold War began, Turkey made its strategic choice clearly and firmly: the West. In 1952, Turkey joined NATO, becoming the alliance's crucial southeastern anchor. Turkish troops fought alongside Americans in the Korean War, earning a fierce reputation for battlefield courage. The United States stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union. But this alignment came with costs. Turkey's political system was volatile. Military coups overthrew civilian governments in 1960, 1971, and 1980, each time with the military claiming it was protecting Ataturk's secular vision from politicians who were becoming either too radical or too religious. This pattern of military intervention became a defining feature of Turkish democracy, a democracy that was never quite fully free. The Kurdish question, never resolved, never addressed honestly, simmered into open conflict. The PKK, a Kurdish militant organization, launched an insurgency in 1984 that would cost over 40,000 lives over the following decades and create a permanent security crisis in southeastern Turkey. And yet, through all of this turbulence, Turkey continued to grow. The economy expanded. The cities swelled with rural migrants. A new middle class emerged, more conservative, more religious than the Kemalist elite, but ambitious and entrepreneurial. In 2002, everything changed again. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and his Justice and Development Party, the AKP, swept to power in a landslide election that stunned the Turkish establishment. Erdogan came from a background that the Kemalist elite had always feared and suppressed. He was openly religious, socially conservative, and rooted in the urban poor of Istanbul rather than the military secular aristocracy. In his early years in power, Erdogan was celebrated internationally. He pursued EU membership aggressively, implementing democratic reforms, reducing military influence in politics, improving relations with minorities, and overseeing an economic boom that transformed Turkey into one of the world's fastest-growing economies. GDP per capita tripled in a decade. Istanbul became a global city. Turkish soap operas conquered audiences from Morocco to Indonesia. Soft power, cultural influence, became a deliberate instrument of Turkish foreign policy. But as Erdogan's power consolidated, a different leader began to emerge. The EU membership process stalled. Relations with Europe and the United States became increasingly tense. In 2013, massive protests at Istanbul's Gezi Park, initially against a development project, exploded into a broader anti-government movement. Erdogan responded with force and a hardening of his political style. The failed coup attempt of July 2016 was the defining turning point. When a faction of the military attempted to overthrow Erdogan, the Turkish public, including opposition supporters, came out into the streets and faced down tanks. The coup failed, but Erdogan's response was sweeping. A massive purge of the military, judiciary, universities, and civil service. Tens of thousands were arrested or dismissed. Emergency powers were invoked. In 2017, a constitutional referendum narrowly passed, transforming Turkey from a parliamentary system to a presidential one, concentrating enormous power in Erdogan's hands. Critics called it the end of Turkish democracy. Supporters called it finally giving Turkey strong, decisive leadership. To understand Erdogan's Turkey, you must understand a concept his foreign policy architect Ahmet Davutoglu called strategic depth. The idea is simple but profound. Turkey is not just a republic that emerged in 1923. Turkey is the heir to the entire Ottoman legacy. 6 centuries of civilization, culture, and geopolitical presence across 3 continents. This means Turkey should not be content as merely a NATO member following Western instructions. It should be an independent pole of power, leading the Muslim world, maintaining relationships across the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans, and Central Asia, and pursuing its own strategic interests, even when they conflict with those of its Western allies. This vision has produced some of the most audacious Turkish foreign policy moves in generations. Turkey deployed military forces to Syria, fighting both ISIS and Kurdish forces. It intervened decisively in Libya's civil war, changing the military balance. It launched military operations in northern Iraq against PKK bases. It purchased the Russian S-400 missile defense system, triggering a crisis with NATO and getting expelled from the F-35 fighter jet program. In 2020, Erdogan made his most symbolic move. The Hagia Sophia, converted by Ataturk into a museum as a gesture of secularism, was reconverted into a mosque. The world's headlines screamed, but for Erdogan's supporters, it was a long overdue correction of Ataturk's humiliation of Turkey's Ottoman and Islamic heritage. The message was clear. Turkey was no longer apologizing for its Ottoman past. It was reclaiming it. Today, Turkey stands at a crossroads that would be familiar to any student of its history. The economy has faced severe turbulence. Inflation reached devastating levels, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Turks who had prospered during the early Erdogan years. The lira, Turkey's currency, lost enormous value. The economic miracle that had defined the early AKP era now seemed under threat. Yet Erdogan's political support, while diminished, remained formidable, rooted in the conservative Anatolian heartland and among the religious middle class he had empowered. Geopolitically, Turkey plays all sides simultaneously in a way that drives both Washington and Moscow to frustration and admiration. It is a NATO member that buys Russian air defense systems. It is a Muslim-majority country that maintains diplomatic relations with Israel while also championing Palestinian rights. It mediated between Russia and Ukraine at the start of the 2022 war, positioning itself as an indispensable neutral broker. It blocked Swedish and Finnish NATO membership for over a year, extracting concessions, demonstrating that even America's most powerful military alliance could not ignore Turkish interests. The Kurdish issue remains unresolved, perhaps the most difficult internal challenge Turkey faces. 20% of Turkey's population is Kurdish, and the question of political rights, cultural recognition, and the relationship with Kurdish political parties continues to be a source of deep conflict. And yet, through all of this, Turkey continues. It does not break. It negotiates, it maneuvers, it transforms, exactly as it always has. We began this story with a single word: survival. The Hittites built empires here. The Greeks wrote epics. The Romans built roads. The Byzantines built the greatest cathedral the world had ever seen. The Mongols swept through and destroyed everything. The Crusaders attacked from the west. The Western empires carved up Ottoman lands like a feast. And in 1923, even the Turks themselves attempted to destroy and rebuild their own identity from scratch. And yet, here Turkey stands. It has survived the rise and fall of at least 5 great empires. It has survived colonialism, invasion, revolution, military coups, economic crisis, and the most violent century in human history. It has changed its identity multiple times, from a Turkic tribal confederation to an Islamic empire to a secular republic, and now to something new that does not yet have a clean name. The Ottoman Empire is gone. Formally, legally, irreversibly gone. The Caliphate is gone. Ataturk's rigid secularism is gone. But something deeper than all of these, the strategic instinct, the geopolitical awareness, the survival reflex, that is not gone, that is alive and well, walking the corridors of the presidential palace in Ankara. The question is, what Turkey will become on the other side? What is the next identity? What is the next transformation? Because if history has taught us one single lesson, it is this: Turkey always has a next chapter. The story of 700 years, from the tent of Osman to the palace of Erdogan, is not over. It never really ends. It just keeps transforming. And the world would do well to keep watching.